You're listening to The Conversation. It's July 2025, and Pete Hegseth, the Fox News host turned Donald Trump's defense secretary, is standing on the front lawn of the Pentagon. Above him, a drone is hovering.
So while our adversaries have produced millions of cheap drones, before us, we were mired in bureaucratic red tape. Not anymore. In June, President Trump issued an executive order unleashing American drone dominance.
A few days later, Hegseth tours a display of 18 American-made prototype drones. One of them is called a Lucas. This drone may have been made in America, but its roots are in Iran. It's a reverse-engineered copy of a kamikaze Iranian drone called a Shahed. And now the US military says it's deployed these Lucas drones in its war on Iran. So how did the Iranians develop the Shahed drones in the first place? Why did the US military decide to copy them? And what role will these low-cost drones play in the future of warfare? I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. Today, how the US copied an Iranian drone and used it to bomb Iran. Arun Dawson, you're a researcher and PhD candidate at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where, as part of your research, you look at low-tech drone technology. Welcome to the Conversation Weekly podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Take me back. It's the mid-1980s, and the young Islamic Republic of Iran is in the middle of a war with its neighbour Iraq. What kind of weapons are the Iranians using at that time?
Well, you've got to see that the Iranian military of this time is born out of the Islamic Revolution. So the days of the Shah are gone, the days of the time where Iran could rely on exquisite Western-made technology, primarily American-made technology, all of those days are gone. And now Iran is a pariah state. It's having to be much more self-sufficient. It's under a big sanctions regime. It's finding difficulty in sourcing the spare parts for the Western kit that it has in its inventory. And of course, lots of the very highly capable, highly skilled Iranian Air Force pilots are stuck abroad or are eliminated as part of a purge. The Iranian military of this time is having to improvise. So one of the things that it begins to do is looks at what's going on in its neighborhood. And a few years prior to this war against Iraq, Israel has some hostilities against Lebanon. And the Israelis start to experiment with using some relatively low-cost drones, essentially as decoys. The Israeli system is being developed in conjunction with some German partners. The drones would come in from the Israeli side. Air defenders would see these drones, assume that they're being under attack. They would activate their radar systems. And then Israeli fighter jets would then use their missiles, anti-radiation missiles, to take out these radar systems. So the Iranians that are conducting this war against Iraq are seeing what the Israelis are doing really quite successfully in the context of their efforts against Lebanon and Syria. And they begin copying some of those same techniques. But of course, they have fewer capabilities than the Israelis. So what they resort to instead is using essentially hobby drones, very rudimentary systems, remote-controlled systems. Those are the only things that the Iranians have access to and can build domestically.
And do some of these at that point include weapons, actual airborne bombs?
Some of them, but in very small quantities. They're primarily used to increase the Iranian picture of Iraqi targets. It's reconnaissance. It's not necessarily strike at this stage. Iran learns from this and as a military lesson and begins also to invest in these capabilities, albeit at a slow rate because, of course, it's under all of these international pressures.
When does Iran then start thinking about turning these weapons into kamikaze drones, drones that will actually hit a target and try and take it out?
In the 1990s and then into the early 2000s, they are beginning to tentatively explore some of these weapon-equipped drone systems. The Shahed family of drones begins to come on the radar, if you pardon the pun, in the mid 2010s. So we see some early reporting in 2015 that Iran is developing these systems, but it's really in 2019 where they make a splash on the front page of newspapers across the world. They feature as a system that allegedly launched from Iran, but is attacking Saudi oil facilities.
New video emerging tonight of an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia billowing smoke after an Iranian drone attack.
There was no warning necessarily that these drones existed. So it was a big surprise to not only the Saudis, but also its allies as well. And this is when many people in the intelligence community, but also policymakers as well, recognized that the threat level has upped quite considerably.
We actually mentioned this attack in an episode of our podcast a couple of weeks ago because it was quite a pivotal moment in the way Saudi Arabia viewed its relationship with Iran. What could we see from that attack about what these drones could do and what was unique about them?
Several things. The first is that these systems are traveling at quite low altitudes and at quite low speed. So they evade what radar would traditionally be looking out for. That is to say, a high speed, high altitude aircraft. And so if you're ducking beneath the radar, you're able to get much closer to targets of interest before they have an opportunity to respond. So there's definitely a shock factor. The other surprising factor with these systems is just how hardy they are. So they are simply made out of plywood and foam for the most part, so pretty rudimentary materials. It's equipped with a piston engine, which is slightly more powerful than a 1960s Volkswagen Beetle, and it has a whole series of GPS redundancy. So GPS is the global navigation system that was developed by the United States, but Russia and China have their own versions as well. And these Shahed drones are able to pivot from one to the other if they find that one of those systems is degraded. So these Shahed drones are pretty resilient to things like jamming. They're not invulnerable to them, but again, they're relatively cheap, that if a few of them get shot down, you're still being able to strike the targets where it matters.
Come 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, how did Shahed drones start to be used there?
The first set of Iranian drones that really made an impact were the Shahed 131s. And they were used in Russia at the very onset of its war against Ukraine.
Ukrainian officials say Russia has launched more than 300 Iranian drones, targeting civilian buildings as well as key energy infrastructure, causing blackouts and concerns about heating ahead of winter.
And then over a period of time, once the Iranians had learned firsthand what using these Shahed 131s would look like at scale against a pretty sizable military, they then developed them into the Shahed 136s. And the 136s at the moment are operated in Russia as the Garand 2s. And the 136s have several additional benefits over the 131s. They have a slightly longer range, they have a larger weapons payload, and they can also still be produced at a relatively large scale and at a lower price point. So there is a constant level of collaboration between the Iranians and the Russians, where the Iranians are providing lots of this technology, but the Russians are pursuing domestic manufacture of them, and then in turn providing Iran with some of the lessons from how these actually operate in practice.
What kind of lessons?
Lessons in terms of the optimum way of attacking some of these systems, how to make sure that they evade electronic warfare and jamming, and also increasingly lessons in terms of autonomy. Because if you're having autonomous systems, they don't need to rely on external sources in order to direct their flight trajectory. You can have a system that dynamically responds to the environment and is pretty resistant to some of the current efforts by the Ukrainians and others to jam these systems.
So that would mean they wouldn't necessarily have a target from outset. An operator could adjust it in flight and they could move somewhere else.
They could adjust it in flight, but also these systems taken to the extreme could, for want of a better word, be killer robots, and they could decide what would be the best target to attack.
So when do the Americans first become interested in copying a Shahed drone? And why do they even want to?
The Americans have had a very interesting experience with these low-tech drones. You've got to wind the clock back to its interventions against ISIS in the Middle East, where drones really start becoming a problem for them. ISIS use these hobby drones that you can buy off the internet for a fairly low price, equip them with a grenade, and then drop them on troops.
Islamic State uses weaponized drones to target Iraqi forces trying to retake the city of Mosul, which the group seized in 2014.
Where they begin to see, actually, this is a system that we ought to start using offensively, is in Russia, Ukraine. So in that context, you're seeing two traditional militaries employing drones. So America is seeing these, what it would regard as more inferior military forces employing these systems, but using them pretty effectively. And it's getting some ideas from seeing that experience firsthand.
And what's the economics of doing this?
The price point of the Shahed drones varies from 20 to 50,000, against which at the moment the Gulf countries in the Middle East are expending Patriot missiles, which cost between $3 to $6 million a piece. So you're taking out a system with something that costs many times more. And that costs a great deal in the long term. Now, the Russians are also producing these in quite large numbers, estimates of about 50,000 produced annually. And the cost of producing them will range in Russia versus Iran. Most of them will go against Ukraine, but it just shows the scale of production capacity that exists on these lower end spectrums. In contrast, the Patriot missiles that the Gulf countries are using against these drones, you would struggle to reach 700, 800 units annually. Very quickly, you find that this is an economic battle as much as it is a military one.
I mean, I would have always assumed that the US would have quite advanced drone capacity, but was it just that they weren't thinking of drones as kamikaze attack weapons until around this point?
So the American military has been a pioneer of drone warfare, but the drones that it has traditionally employed are very expensive, medium to high altitude systems capable of providing persistent surveillance over uncontested areas, primarily in the Middle East, but also elsewhere. But they can use these very high cost systems because there's a very low chance that the enemies that they were surveilling or engaging with had the capabilities to shoot them out of the sky. What's changing now are a couple of things. First, the areas in the world where the United States anticipates operating in are not those uncontested environments. Countries like Russia, countries like China, they do have the capability to shoot these exquisite systems out of the sky. Second factor is simply how effective large-scale attritable mass can be. So attritable mass is systems that you can afford to lose in a conflict. So these are really cheap individual units costing a few $1,000s a piece, which in the grand scheme of what Trump wants, $1.5 trillion budget is fairly small fry. So with all of that in mind, the Americans wanted to procure, through what can best be described as illicit means, a copy of an Iranian drone or a Russian equivalent.
Do we know how they did that?
We don't know how they did that. American military officials have been understandably quite tight-lipped about how they have got their hands on these Iranian and Russian systems. We do know that a competition with industry was run last year in which the American government denied industry the opportunity to see some of the systems in its stocks, other than to tell industry that your goal is to try and replicate these drones as best as you can, and then we might have a discussion behind the scenes later on. But it is very cloak and dagger because these are sensitive topics that could define the future of what the American military looks like.
Coming up, the Americans unveil their copy of a Shahed drone and start using it to bomb Iran. That's after this short break.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.
Aaron, in July 2025, the first prototypes are unveiled for a low-cost, uncrewed combat attack system known as a Lucas drone. And it's made by an American defense company called SpectreWorks. What's the difference between an American Lucas drone and an Iranian Shahed one?
The latest versions of the Shaheds are jet-powered systems that are capable of traveling at pretty high speeds. Against those, the Lucas systems are not quite as powerful. They are more similar to the Shahed 136s. So these are the systems that are used in the greatest numbers in the current Russia-Ukraine context, but also that Iran has stockpiled the most. And against that, there are a lot of similarities. There are similarities in terms of how they look, in terms of having a triangle-shaped wing design, in terms of how far they can travel, with reports of around 1,200 to 1,500 miles. They also have a similar top speed of just over 100 miles per hour. So there are lots of characteristics that are similar. What we don't know is how the digital system of these Lucas drones is compared with the Shahed equivalent. Some online analysts have suggested that the Lucas drones come in 2 variants. One where they are conventionally strike, kamikaze focused, and this would be the equivalent of the Shahed 136s. But there are some which have additional modules in, and you could conceive of these as control nodes. So these are Shahed systems that in turn controlled other Shahed drones. And that is a level of networking which currently doesn't exist with the 136s. They are used on one-way attack missions. They have a particular target, they head there, they may circle for a bit, but then they destroy it. If you're starting to network these drones, then you can achieve a much greater level of efficiency and impact. And that is where analysts believe the current Lucas system is geared towards.
How did the Iranians react when the Americans unveiled their Lucas system?
So initially, the Iranians were quite flattered with the fact that the American military was copying their systems. In fact, there's a quote from an IRGC spokesman in December when he first learned of this, in which he remarks, quote, "There is no greater honor than seeing self-proclaimed superpowers kneel before an Iranian drone and copy it." In the intervening period, we have instead seen the Iranians quite nervous about what the Americans are doing.
For the first time in combat, the U.S. military is deploying one-way kamikaze drones that are copycats of Iran's drones.
On February the 28th, the US military announced that it had used one of these Lucas drones in its war on Iran. How are they being used?
We don't know, is the honest answer. So we were informed in December 25 that a squadron of Lucas drones had been sent to what's called Task Force Scorpion Strike, which is part of the US organization responsible for combat operations in the Middle East. Beyond that, we don't know the particular operations or mission sets that these drones have been assigned. So it makes it very difficult to assess in what large numbers, if any, or in what capacity these drones have been used so far. There was some reporting that these Lucas systems had been used in Venezuela in the operation to capture President Maduro, but no official confirmation of that was forthcoming. So this at least marks the first time that they have been used in public in combat operations.
So in the last few days, the Iranians have actually raised the fact that the Americans have copied their drone system as a way of saying, well, who knows who's hitting what in the Gulf? They've been accused of attacking civilian infrastructure in their Gulf neighbors and said it could be an American Lucas drone that looks like one of our Shahed drones. How does the fact that a lot of these countries are now using drone systems that look quite similar, how does that add to the complexity of understanding who's doing what?
It's incredibly difficult. And you may have seen recently that 3 American fighter jets were shot down by Kuwaiti air defense systems. And these are meant to be large aircraft, pretty visible aircraft on radar, and yet they were shot down by countries that are friendly with the United States. So if you think about these drone systems that are being employed, if the Americans are using what looks to be Iranian Shahed drones, if you add Russian systems into the mix and they're Iran 2s or 3s, as is currently being developed, that creates a very murky picture if you're trying to conduct air defense. So there is no easy solution to these operational challenges, but that is the reality of modern day combat. And in fact, one of the benefits of using Shahed drones from an Iranian perspective is that they can be used to equip its proxies in the region. So not only is this a case of distinguishing between Iranian versus Russian versus American systems, but then including within the Iranian network, there are these proxies that are also using these systems, and they may work at cross purposes to whatever the government in Tehran is trying to achieve.
How is the US military thinking about these low-cost drones as part of its military arsenal? Where does it fit and what option does it provide them?
Each of these drones is $35,000. With an American-style defense budget, you can buy enough of them that you completely saturate the capabilities of an adversary to respond. And once you've achieved that, you can then send in your high expense equipment to do the dirty job of delivering pretty large, decisive payloads on particular targets. So that's what the American military is beginning to explore and pivot towards. They are also using a system of network capabilities in order to achieve this. So whether this is drones operating alongside these high-end fighter jets, or whether it is just a collection of drones operating as a swarm, the direction is towards networking these systems together, not having them piloted by individuals or sending them on pre-programmed flight paths.
You talked about their ability to be networked, but how do these drones fit into a future of warfare that uses more AI technology, more autonomous systems?
I think the biggest step change in efficiency for the US military will be reliable use of AI across the whole of its arsenal. At the moment, for very understandable reasons, there is a reluctance on the part of the American domestic population, but even I would say on the part of policymakers to use AI at scale. And this has caused a great deal of controversy at the moment between Silicon Valley and the US administration and the Pentagon specifically, because some tech bros are reluctant to see their technology being used for a whole host of reasons. One is that the technology is not at the level of maturity to provide reliable capability to achieve decisive effects. So there are big question marks in the United States about whether we want to cross that moral, ethical Rubicon of employing these technologies, and in so doing, provide potential adversaries with an excuse for them to start doing similar systems. But it's a much bigger question than simply what America is doing. Its NATO allies are also in a similar bind. They are increasing their defense budgets, but arguably not at the rate that many commentators say is necessary. And one way out of that conundrum is to use low-cost systems akin to Lucas, but networking them using AI. So most NATO militaries are really going in on drone-centric arsenals. But is the AI ready to meet the demands posed on it?
Beyond Iran, where are the Americans looking to in the future for this kind of capability? Were they thinking that Iran would be the first test case for these low-tech drones, or were they looking actually at other potential conflicts?
In the grand scheme of things, the Middle East is relatively low priority compared with an adversary like China. And in that context, there are a whole load of question marks over how effective these low-cost systems will be. China is very interested in reuniting Taiwan, which it considers as a breakaway province, with the larger People's Republic. This is a red line for the United States, assuming that the United States does respond to China's annexation of Taiwan. It's likely to be a maritime, amphibious air environment. And within that situation, what you're likely to see is Allied troops hopping from island to island in order to secure a chain of bases that can be used then to stage an operation against, for example, Taiwan to resecure it, or against the Chinese mainland. And if you're trying to do that, then Lucas drones could be quite a useful tool, because you're thinking about relatively short ranges. If you're thinking about marines and amphibious forces, you can launch these drones against shipping. You can use them on a very tactical level. Those are all good things. But the problem remains how to get them there in such a way that it goes undetected by the Chinese military, or indeed any others acting in conjunction with them. That's the difficulty, and it's a very different operation compared to what the Americans are doing in the context of the Middle East right now.
Thank you so much, Arun. It's been fantastic talking with you and learning about these drones, so thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more analysis about the Iran conflict from researchers around the world on The Conversation. We'll put some links for further reading in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Ment Marawani and me, Gemma Ware. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Sull. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with as wide an audience as possible. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It helps us reach new people. Thanks for listening.
Hiya, I'm Katie Edwards, and I'm a health editor at The Conversation.
I'm Dan Baumgart. I'm a lecturer in health and life sciences at the University of Bristol, where I also work as a GP.
And we work together a lot, and we try to explain weird and wonderful things about the body. And now we're teaming up to host Strange Health, which is a new video podcast from The Conversation.
So each episode, we're going to be taking a health trend going viral on social media.
You know the kind of thing. Drink chlorophyll to make sure you don't stink.
Do you really need to detox in January?
Have a supplement to make your bum look better. All that kind of thing. Each week, it's going to be me and Dan, plus an expert, who are going to thrash out between the truths and the myths.
You know, me being an anatomist, I was like, oh, can I have a look? And it was huge.
The liver is amazing. It's probably the only organ that can regenerate itself completely.
And we're calling it Strange Health because we're not scared of disgusting things. Episode 1 arrives on the 20th of January. So follow us on YouTube or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.